The autumn wind swept through downtown Nashville, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and distant barbecue smoke from the honky-tonk district. Sarah Martinez clutched her worn guitar case closer to her chest as she navigated the crowded sidewalk on Broadway, her weathered boots clicking against the concrete with each determined step. The neon lights of the famous music venues cast colorful shadows across her face, highlighting the premature lines that 3 years of homelessness had etched around her once bright brown eyes. At 34, Sarah had been living on Nashville's streets since losing her job as a music teacher and subsequently her apartment. What started as a temporary setback had spiraled into a seemingly endless cycle of survival. Her teaching credentials meant nothing when she couldn't afford the professional clothes for interviews, and her music degree felt like a cruel joke when her most pressing concern was finding a warm place to sleep each night. The October morning had been particularly difficult. Sarah had spent the previous night in a crowded shelter downtown, where the combination of fluorescent lights, crying children, and the constant worry about her belongings had made sleep nearly impossible. She had awakened before dawn, gathered her few possessions, and made her way to the McDonald's on Church Street, where she used the restroom to wash her face and hands with paper towels and soap from the dispenser. "Just one more corner," she whispered to herself, the same mantra she'd repeated for months. Each day, she stationed herself outside the Ryman Auditorium, hoping someone would drop enough change into her guitar case to buy a hot meal. Today felt different somehow, though she couldn't explain why. The October sky hung heavy with clouds that promised rain, and she knew she needed to earn enough for both food and a night at the shelter. The walk from the shelter to her usual performing spot took her past reminders of the life she had lost. She passed the elementary school where she had once taught music, its playground now filled with children she would never have the chance to inspire. The sight of young faces through the chain-link fence brought back memories of lesson plans and Christmas concerts, of parents thanking her for helping their children find confidence through song. Sarah found her usual spot near the brick wall of the historic venue and carefully removed her acoustic guitar from its battered case. The instrument had been her grandfather's, a 1969 Martin D28 that had somehow survived every hardship she'd faced. Its wood was scarred and the finish worn, but it still produced the warm, rich tones that had once filled her childhood with wonder. The guitar was more than an instrument. It was her connection to better times, to the grandfather who had taught her that music could heal hearts and bridge differences between people. He had been a migrant worker who played in church on Sundays and at family gatherings, his calloused hands moving across the strings with surprising gentleness. "Mija," he used to tell her in his mixture of Spanish and English, "music is the language that speaks when words are not enough. You remember that." As she began to tune the strings, her fingers moved with the practiced precision of someone who had been playing since age 7. A small crowd of tourists paused to watch, their cameras already recording as she started with a gentle rendition of Amazing Grace. Her voice, clear and powerful despite everything she'd endured, rose above the street noise and seemed to create a bubble of peace around her small corner of the world. The first few dollars landed softly in her case as passers-by were moved by the haunting beauty of her performance. Sarah closed her eyes and let the music transport her back to better times, standing in front of her 5th-grade class, teaching children how to find their voices, or sitting on her grandmother's porch in rural Tennessee, learning the folk songs that had been passed down through generations. She transitioned into Hallelujah, Leonard Cohen's masterpiece that had become a favorite among street performers for its ability to move audiences regardless of their musical preferences. Her interpretation was uniquely her own, influenced by years of gospel music in her childhood church and the raw emotional honesty that came from experiencing life's hardest lessons firsthand. "That's a beautiful voice you have there." Sarah opened her eyes to see a middle-aged man in worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt standing a few feet away. He was tall and lean, with graying hair beneath a black cowboy hat, and something about his presence commanded attention without demanding it. What struck her most were his eyes, kind and genuinely interested, not the hurried or pitying looks she usually received. There was something familiar about him, though Sarah couldn't place it immediately. He had the weathered look of someone who had worked with his hands, but also carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to respect. He wasn't filming with his phone like most passers-by, just standing and listening with the attention of someone who understood music from the inside. "Thank you, sir," she replied, continuing to strum softly. "Do you have a favorite song you'd like to hear?" The man smiled and stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the pavement. How about He Stopped Loving Her Today, George Jones version, if you know it. Sarah's fingers found the chords instinctively, and she began the heart-wrenching ballad that many considered the greatest country song ever written. As she sang, she noticed the man's expression change, his casual demeanor replaced by something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or professional appreciation. Her voice carried the weight of lived experience, transforming the familiar lyrics into something raw and honest. The song told the story of a man who loved a woman until the day he died, never getting over their separation. As Sarah sang the words, she thought about her own losses, not just of romantic love, but of the life she had built, the career she had loved, the sense of purpose that had once defined her. The lyrics took on new meaning when sung by someone who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. A larger crowd had gathered now, tourists and locals alike, drawn by the magnetic quality of her performance. Someone shouted, "Encore!" as she finished, and several more bills found their way into her guitar case. But the man in the cowboy hat remained perfectly still, studying her with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be forward, but I have to ask, have you ever recorded professionally?" Sarah shook her head, suddenly self-conscious. "I was a music teacher for 8 years, but that was before." She gestured vaguely at her surroundings, unable to voice the full story of how her life had unraveled. The journey from middle-class professional to homeless street performer had been gradual, then sudden. First came her parents' death in a car accident, leaving her without the emotional and financial support system she had always taken for granted. The grief had made it difficult to focus on her teaching, and her performance reviews had suffered. When budget cuts forced the school district to eliminate positions, she had been among the first to go. Without health insurance, the anxiety and depression that followed became impossible to treat professionally. She had burned through her savings quickly, then moved to cheaper and cheaper apartments until even those became unaffordable. Friends had helped initially, but their assistance had limits, and Sarah's pride had made it difficult to accept charity from people who were struggling with their own financial challenges. "Would you mind if I asked your name?" "Sarah Martinez," she said, then added with a bitter laugh, "though I doubt that means anything to anyone anymore." The man extended his hand. "Well, Sarah Martinez, I'm Alan Jackson, and I think you might be surprised by what your name could mean." Sarah's guitar nearly slipped from her lap. Alan Jackson, the country music legend whose songs had provided the soundtrack to her childhood, whose records her grandfather had played on repeat during Sunday afternoons, whose music had inspired her own journey into teaching and performing. She looked at him again, really looked, and suddenly the familiar features became unmistakable. You're really Alan Jackson," she stammered, her composure finally cracking. "I am," he said gently, "and I've been standing here for the better part of an hour listening to you sing. Sarah, I haven't heard a voice like yours in more years than I care to count. It's honest, it's powerful, and it tells a story that people need to hear." The crowd around them had grown even larger, phones appearing as word spread through the gathering that a country music superstar was talking to the street performer. But Alan seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on Sarah. She could see recognition dawning in the faces around them, tourists realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "I know this might sound crazy," he continued, "but I'm recording a new album, and I've been looking for something special, something real. Would you be interested in coming to my studio tomorrow? Not as a charity case," he added quickly, seeing the defensive look that crossed her face, "but as an artist, as someone who has something genuine to offer." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. After 3 years of rejection, of being invisible, of having her talents dismissed or ignored, here was one of country music's biggest stars offering her a chance. But along with the overwhelming gratitude came a familiar voice of doubt, the one that had grown stronger with each failed job interview and each night spent in shelters. "Mr. Jackson," she said carefully, "I appreciate the kindness. I really do. But I don't have proper clothes for a recording studio, and I haven't had access to regular showers or—" She trailed off, embarrassed by the practical realities of her situation. The truth was that homelessness affected every aspect of daily life in ways that housed people rarely considered. Simple things like staying clean, keeping clothes wrinkle-free, or having a reliable phone number became monumental challenges. Even if she had the talent for professional music, she lacked the basic infrastructure that the industry took for granted. "Sarah," Alan said, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved by millions. Talent doesn't require a business suit. It requires heart, and you've got more of that than most people I work with. As for everything else, we'll figure it out. That's what people do for each other. They help solve problems. He pulled a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it to her, along with $100 bill. This is for tonight. Get yourself a hotel room, a hot meal, whatever you need. The address on that card is my recording studio. Be there tomorrow at 2 o'clock and we'll see what happens. As quickly as he had appeared, Alan Jackson melted back into the crowd, leaving Sarah standing with shaking hands and a guitar case full of more money than she'd seen in months. The gathering of onlookers began to disperse, many of them approaching to drop additional bills and words of encouragement before moving on. Several people asked to take pictures with her, suddenly treating her like a celebrity rather than an invisible homeless person. "That was incredible," said a young woman with a southern accent. "I've never seen anything like that happen before. You must be so talented to catch Alan Jackson's attention like that." Sarah nodded numbly, still processing what had just occurred. Part of her wondered if it had been an elaborate hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion. But the business card in her hand was real, as was the crisp $100 bill that represented more financial security than she had possessed in years. That evening, as Sarah sat in her first hotel room in 3 years, showered and fed for the first time in recent memory, she held the business card up to the lamplight. "Jackson Recording Studio," it read in simple black letters. Below that, in Alan's handwriting, "Looking forward to hearing that beautiful voice again, AJ." The hotel room felt like a palace after years of shelters and park benches. The bed was soft, the shower had unlimited hot water, and the simple pleasure of being able to close a door and have privacy was almost overwhelming. She ordered room service, the first restaurant meal she'd eaten in months, and sat by the window looking out at Nashville's skyline while she ate. She picked up her grandfather's guitar and played softly, her voice carrying new hope as she sang into the quiet room. Outside her window, Nashville's lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time in years, Sarah Martinez allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might bring something wonderful. The card lay on the nightstand beside her, a small rectangle that represented the possibility of a new beginning. As she drifted off to sleep in actual sheets with actual pillows, Sarah dreamed of music that could heal hearts and voices that could change the world. In her dreams, she was back in her childhood church, singing in the choir while her grandfather played guitar, his weathered hands showing her the chords that would carry her through the darkest times and into the light. Sarah woke before dawn in her hotel room, immediately disoriented by the softness of the bed and the absence of street noise. For a moment, she wondered if the previous day had been an elaborate dream. Surely Alan Jackson hadn't really invited a homeless woman to his recording studio. But there on the nightstand lay the business card, and in the chair sat the clean clothes she'd purchased the evening before with part of the money from her guitar case. The shopping trip had been an adventure in itself. After finishing her room service dinner, Sarah had ventured to a nearby thrift store that stayed open late. She had spent 2 hours carefully selecting items that would help her look presentable without completely depleting her newfound resources. A simple black dress, a cardigan that had seen better days but was clean and professional, and a pair of low-heeled shoes that actually fit. The saleswoman, an elderly African-American lady named Dorothy, had noticed Sarah counting and recounting her money with the intensity of someone for whom every dollar mattered enormously. "Honey," Dorothy had said quietly, "you take that cardigan without charge. Something tells me you're going somewhere important tomorrow." When Sarah had tried to protest, Dorothy had simply smiled and said, "Baby, I've been working in this store for 15 years. I can tell when someone's getting ready for their big break. You just make sure you remember us little people when you make it big." And now, as Sarah showered for the second time in 12 hours, a luxury she couldn't quite believe, she reflected on the small kindnesses that had punctuated her years on the street. People like Dorothy, who saw past circumstances to recognize shared humanity, had kept her faith alive when everything else seemed lost. The shower was a small miracle. For 3 years, bathing had meant hurried visits to public restrooms or the occasional shower at a homeless shelter, always rushed and never private. Standing under the steady stream of hot water, using actual shampoo and conditioner, feeling truly clean for the first time in months, Sarah wept with gratitude for something most people took for granted. She spent extra time getting ready, carefully applying the small amount of makeup she had purchased and trying to tame her hair into something resembling a professional style. The woman looking back at her from the mirror was recognizable, but different, cleaner, more hopeful. carrying herself with a dignity that had been worn down but not destroyed by years of hardship. By noon, Sarah was standing outside Jackson Recording Studio, a modest building tucked away from Nashville's main tourist corridors. The sign was understated, professional without being flashy. She had arrived 2 hours early, too nervous to wait in her hotel room any longer, and spent the time walking the neighborhood, clutching her guitar case and trying to calm her racing heart. The area around the studio was quiet, residential almost, with tree-lined streets and older homes that had been converted to businesses. It was a part of Nashville that tourists rarely saw, where the real work of music happened away from the neon lights and crowds of Broadway. Sarah passed other small studios, management companies, and publishing houses, each representing someone's dream of making it in the music industry. At exactly 1:55, she approached the front desk, where a young man with kind eyes and a genuine smile greeted her. "You must be Sarah Martinez," he said before she could introduce herself. "I'm Marcus, Alan's assistant. He's been talking about you all morning, and honestly, he hasn't been this excited about a new artist in years. Ready to make some music?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Marcus led her through a hallway lined with gold records and photographs of Alan with various country music legends, Hank Williams Jr., George Strait, Randy Travis, and countless others who had shaped the sound of country music over the decades. "Alan's been in this business for over 30 years, Marcus explained as they walked, "and he's pretty selective about who he works with these days. The fact that he sought you out after hearing you perform means he sees something really special in your voice." Marcus opened a door to reveal a spacious recording studio filled with natural light from skylights overhead. The room was larger than Sarah's last apartment had been, with professional equipment that represented more money than she had seen in years. But what struck her most was how comfortable it felt, more like a living room than the intimidating technical environment she had expected. Alan Jackson stood near a microphone setup, wearing the same casual attire as the day before. But now Sarah could see the professional equipment that surrounded him. Sound engineers moved quietly around the room, adjusting levels and positioning microphones, while Alan studied a piece of sheet music with the concentration of a master craftsman. "Sarah!" He looked up with a genuine smile that immediately put her at ease. "I'm so glad you came. I wasn't entirely sure you would. Sometimes when the reality of an opportunity sets in, people get scared and back out." "To be honest, neither was I," Sarah admitted, then quickly added, "But I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Jackson. I still can't quite believe this is happening. Please call me Alan, and the gratitude goes both ways. You're doing me a favor by being here." He gestured toward the microphones. "I've been working on a song for months, and I couldn't quite get it right. Yesterday, listening to you sing, I realized what it was missing. It needed someone who could bring real experience to the lyrics, someone who had lived the story the song is trying to tell." He handed her the sheet music, and Sarah's eyes widened as she read the title. "When Tomorrow Seems Too Far." The lyrics spoke of struggle, of holding on to hope when everything seemed lost, of finding strength in unexpected places. It was as if the song had been written specifically for her journey, capturing emotions she had never been able to articulate. "Alan," she said softly, "this is beautiful. But I have to ask, why me? You could have any vocalist in Nashville, people with experience and reputation and recording contracts. And none of them have lived this song the way you have," Alan interrupted gently. "Sarah, I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I've learned to recognize authenticity when I hear it. Yesterday, you weren't just singing notes and words. You were sharing your heart, your experience, your truth. That's what makes the difference between good music and great music." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the sound engineer, a woman in her 40s named Linda, who had worked with some of country music's biggest names. She introduced herself to Sarah with professional warmth, explaining how the recording process would work and what to expect. "Don't worry about making mistakes," Linda said, adjusting the microphone to Sarah's height. "We can do as many takes as you need, and the beauty of digital recording is that we can piece together the best parts of each performance. Just focus on telling the story that the song wants to tell." The next hour was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Alan was patient, encouraging, and incredibly skilled at helping her find the emotional center of each phrase. The sound engineers, initially skeptical about working with an unknown singer, were soon completely absorbed in capturing the magic that happened when Sarah's voice met Alan's lyrics. "Let's try it again," Alan said after their third run-through. "But this time, I want you to forget about the microphone, forget about all of us watching. Just sing it like you're sitting on your grandmother's porch, telling her story to the world. Sarah closed her eyes and found that quiet place inside herself where the music lived. When she opened her mouth to sing, her voice carried not just the melody, but the weight of every difficult night, every moment of doubt, every small kindness that had kept her going. The words flowed naturally, as if she had written them herself based on her own experiences. The song spoke of nights when tomorrow seemed impossibly far away, when the next day felt like a mountain too high to climb. But it also spoke of the small lights that guided people through darkness, a stranger's kindness, a moment of beauty, the persistent hope that somehow things could get better. In the control room, the engineers exchanged glances. One of them, a veteran of countless recording sessions, whispered to his colleague, "I've got chills. She's something special. This isn't just singing. This is storytelling at its finest." When the song ended, the studio was completely silent for a moment. Then Alan began to clap, followed by everyone else in the room. But what struck Sarah most was the emotion in Alan's eyes, not pity or surprise, but deep professional respect and recognition of genuine artistry. "Sarah," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "that was one of the most powerful performances I've ever heard in this studio. And believe me, I've recorded with some incredible artists over the years. What you just did, that was pure magic." The session continued for another 3 hours, with Alan having Sarah record several more songs, some covers of classics and others original compositions he'd been working on. Each performance revealed new layers to her voice, new colors and textures that seemed perfectly suited to country music's storytelling tradition. They recorded Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, Willie Nelson's classic, with Sarah's interpretation bringing new depth to the familiar lyrics. Her version of Crazy, Patsy Cline's signature song, showcased the lower register of her voice and her ability to convey complex emotions through subtle vocal choices. But it was the original material that truly showcased Sarah's unique talents. Alan played her a song he'd written called Invisible, about people who go through life unseen and unheard by society. Sarah's performance transformed it into something profound, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced that invisibility firsthand. During a break, Sarah found herself alone with Alan in the studio, while the engineers worked on preliminary mixes in the control room. "Can I ask you something?" she said, tuning her grandfather's guitar. "Of course. Yesterday, you could have just dropped some money in my case and walked on. Most people do. What made you stop and really listen? What made you see something worth investing in?" Alan was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently playing a simple melody on the piano beside him. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience. "My grandmother," he said finally. "She lived through the Great Depression, raised 6 children mostly on her own when my grandfather couldn't find steady work. She used to tell me that the best stories come from the people who've had to be strongest, who've survived things that would break other folks. She said you could hear it in their voices, a depth that can't be faked or taught or manufactured." He looked directly at Sarah, his eyes reflecting years of experience in an industry that often valued image over authenticity. "Yesterday, I heard my grandmother's wisdom in your voice. You've been tested in ways that most of us never will be, and instead of becoming bitter or broken, you've become deeper. That's a gift, Sarah, and it's one that the world needs to hear. Too much of today's music is shallow, manufactured for quick consumption. What you have is real, and real is what people are hungry for." Sarah felt tears threatening and quickly looked away. She had grown so accustomed to being seen as a problem to be solved or a situation to be avoided, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be valued for her strengths rather than defined by her circumstances. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. "That depends on what you want to happen," Alan replied. "I'd like to offer you a recording contract, nothing huge or overwhelming at first, but something that gives you a chance to share your music with people who need to hear it. I'd also like to help you get back on your feet in practical ways. Housing, healthcare, whatever you need to focus on your art without worrying about survival." Sarah's hands stilled on her guitar strings. "Alan, I don't know what to say. This feels too good to be true. 3 days ago I was sleeping in a shelter, and now you're talking about recording contracts." "It's not charity," he said firmly, anticipating her concern. "It's investment in talent. You have something that can't be taught or manufactured. You have a voice that tells the truth. In a world full of noise, that's exactly what we need more of. And from a purely business perspective, authentic voices like yours are rare and valuable." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Nashville's skyline. Sarah, I've been successful in this business for a long time, and I've learned that real talent is the most important ingredient in lasting music. You can manufacture a lot of things. You can create an image, you can write catchy hooks, you can use technology to fix vocal problems. But you can't manufacture authenticity, and you can't fake the kind of emotional depth that comes from real experience. As the afternoon sun streamed through the studio skylights, casting warm light across the instruments and equipment, Sarah Martinez looked around at the professional setup, the gold records on the walls, the faces of people who had spent the day taking her seriously as an artist. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to think about a future that extended beyond the next meal or the next safe place to sleep. The scared woman who had woken up in a hotel room that morning was still there, but she was joined now by someone Sarah had almost forgotten existed: the artist, the teacher, the dreamer who believed that music could change hearts and heal wounds. As she prepared to leave the studio with a contract to review and a check that would allow her to start rebuilding her life, Sarah realized that this wasn't just about getting a second chance. This was about remembering who she had always been underneath all the hardship, and finally having the opportunity to show the world what that person could do. The scared, homeless woman and the talented musician had always been the same person. Circumstances had just made it impossible for the world to see both sides of her story. Now, finally, she had the chance to be whole again. 3 weeks after that first recording session, Sarah Martinez stood in the small Nashville apartment that Alan Jackson's team had helped her secure, staring at her reflection in an actual full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the street performer who had played outside the Ryman Auditorium. Her hair, professionally styled for the first time in years, framed a face that had regained some of its color and vitality. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in her eyes, a spark of purpose that had been dormant for too long. The apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to working professionals. But to Sarah, it felt like a mansion. Having her own key, her own mailbox, her own space where she could close the door and be alone with her thoughts, represented a kind of freedom she had almost forgotten existed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Ready for today? Van picks you up at 9 a.m. Radio interviews can be nerve-wracking, but you're going to be amazing. Just be yourself. That's what people want to hear." Today marked the debut of When Tomorrow Seems Too Far on several major country music radio stations across the South. Alan had insisted on a low-key release strategy, wanting the song to build naturally based on its merit, rather than manufactured hype. They had recorded a simple acoustic version, just Sarah's voice and Alan's guitar, that showcased the raw emotion of the performance without overproducing it. The strategy was intentional. Alan believed that Sarah's story would be most powerful if it emerged organically, with the music leading the way, rather than the circumstances of her discovery. "Let people fall in love with your voice first," he had advised. "The rest of your story will mean more to them once they've connected with your art." The phone rang, and Sarah's heart jumped when she saw it was her sister Eleanor calling from Phoenix. They had reconnected 2 weeks earlier when Sarah finally had a stable address and phone number. The conversation had been tearful and difficult, with 3 years of worry, anger, and missed connections to work through. Elena had been furious at first, angry that Sarah had disappeared, that she had refused help, that she had put the family through years of not knowing whether she was alive or dead. But underneath the anger was relief so profound that both sisters had cried for an hour during their first phone call. "Sarah, I just heard your song on KYKY. Elena's voice was thick with emotion. "I'm sitting in my car in a parking lot crying my eyes out. I can't believe that's really you on the radio. When I heard your voice, I knew immediately. I'd recognize your singing anywhere." "I can't believe it either," Sarah admitted, sinking into the second-hand armchair that now represented luxury beyond measure. "Elena, I know I should have called sooner, should have let you know I was okay." "Stop," Elena interrupted. "We talked about this. You did what you needed to do to survive. I may not understand all of it, but I understand that you were in a dark place and you needed to find your own way out. What matters is that you're back and you're sharing this incredible gift with the world." Eleanor's voice grew softer. "Mama and Daddy would be so proud. Do you remember how Daddy used to make us perform little concerts in the living room? He always said you had something special, that your voice could touch people's hearts in ways that most singers never could. Their parents had died in a car accident 7 years earlier, leaving Sarah and Elena to navigate their adult lives without the family foundation they had always counted on. In many ways, Sarah's descent into homelessness had begun with that loss. The grief had made it difficult to focus on work, leading to the job loss that had started her downward spiral. "I've been thinking about them a lot lately," Sarah said. "Remember how Daddy used to say that music was God's way of helping people heal from things they couldn't explain in words? I think maybe he was preparing me for this somehow, for using my voice to help other people through difficult times." "He'd love knowing that your voice is doing that for other people now," Elena replied. "Sarah, I've been getting calls and messages all morning from people who heard the song. Apparently, it's being shared all over social media. People are calling it authentic and powerful, and they're talking about you like you're already a star." After they hung up, Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the Nashville skyline. She could see the building where she had recorded the song, and beyond that, the streets where she had spent so many difficult nights. The contrast wasn't lost on her, but neither was the responsibility that came with this unexpected platform. The morning of radio interviews began at WSIX, one of Nashville's most influential country stations. Sarah sat in the lobby, nervous but determined, when a familiar voice called her name. "Sarah Martinez? I'm Jake Mitchell. I've been looking forward to this interview all week." Jake was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of enthusiasm that made him perfect for morning radio. As he led her through the station, she could see the walls covered with photographs of country music legends who had visited over the years. "I have to tell you," Jake said as they entered the studio, "in 15 years of radio, I don't think I've ever had such an immediate response to a new song. The phones haven't stopped ringing since we first played When Tomorrow Seems Too Far this morning. People want to know about you, about your story. Are you comfortable sharing some of that?" Sarah had prepared for this question, working with a media coach that Alan's team had provided. But now, sitting under the bright lights with the microphone in front of her, she realized that no amount of preparation could substitute for simply telling the truth. "Jake, 3 months ago I was homeless, living on Nashville's streets and playing my grandfather's guitar for enough change to buy food," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the admission. "I never expected to be sitting here today, but I think that's exactly why this song resonates with people. All of us have faced times when tomorrow seemed too far away to reach, when we didn't know how we were going to make it through another day. What changed for you? How did you go from the streets to recording with Alan Jackson?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Alan saw something in my voice that I had forgotten was there. But more than that, he reminded me that our struggles don't define us. They refine us. Every person who dropped $1 in my guitar case, every shelter worker who treated me with dignity, every moment when I could have given up but chose to keep singing instead. All of that is in this song now." The phones were indeed ringing constantly in the background, and Jake held up a hand full of messages from listeners. "Sarah, we're getting calls from people who say this song helped them through depression, through job loss, through divorce, through addiction recovery. One woman called to say she played it for her teenage daughter who's been struggling with self-harm, and it sparked the first real conversation they'd had in months. How does it feel to know that your voice is having this kind of impact?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jake was describing. She thought about all the times she had felt invisible, unheard, as if her pain didn't matter to anyone. "It's humbling," she said finally. "For so long I felt like my voice didn't matter, like I was invisible. To know that my experience, as painful as it's been, might help someone else feel less alone. That gives meaning to everything I went through. It makes me understand that maybe I was supposed to go through those dark times so I could help light the way for someone else." After the interview, Sarah was driven to 3 more radio stations across Nashville, each one bringing similar responses from listeners. The pattern was consistent. People were connecting with the song on a deep emotional level, sharing their own stories of struggle and resilience. At WMOT, the afternoon DJ, a veteran broadcaster named Carol Williams, asked a question that stopped Sarah cold. "Sarah, you've talked about the positive response to your song, but I have to ask, are you worried about being defined by your homelessness? Are you concerned that people will see you as the homeless singer, rather than just a singer who happens to have been homeless?" It was a question Sarah had been wrestling with privately, and hearing it asked directly forced her to confront her fears. "That's something I think about every day," she admitted. I don't want to be famous for being homeless. I want to be known for my music, for what it can do for people. But I also can't pretend that experience didn't shape who I am as an artist. The challenge is finding the balance between honoring that part of my story and not letting it overshadow the music itself. Carol nodded approvingly. That's a very mature perspective, and I think the fact that you're conscious of that balance will help you maintain it. Your song stands on its own merit. People aren't connecting with it because they feel sorry for you, but because it speaks to something universal in the human experience. When Sarah returned to her apartment that evening, she found it buzzing with activity. Alan was there with his publicist, Marcus, and several other team members, all gathered around laptops and phones. The energy was electric, reminiscent of a campaign headquarters on election night. "Sarah!" Alan stood up with a huge grin that transformed his usually composed demeanor. "Do you have any idea what's happening right now?" She shook her head, still processing the whirlwind of radio interviews and the overwhelming response from listeners across the region. "The song has been downloaded over 50,000 times since this morning," Marcus reported, looking at his laptop screen with amazement. "It's trending on Twitter and TikTok, and someone posted a video of your original street performance that's been viewed over 1 million times. The major music blogs are calling it the most authentic country song in years." Alan's publicist, a sharp woman named Jennifer Chen, who had worked with some of Nashville's biggest stars, looked up from her phone with barely contained excitement. "We're getting interview requests from Good Morning America, The Today Show, 60 Minutes, and Nashville Scene. Sarah, you're about to become very busy, and we need to make sure we handle this the right way." The room fell quiet as everyone looked at Sarah, waiting for her reaction. She sat down slowly on her couch, trying to process what was happening. Just that morning, she had been nervous about a few local radio interviews. Now they were talking about national television. "I need to ask you all something," she said carefully, her voice carrying the thoughtfulness that had impressed Alan from their first meeting. "This is wonderful, and I'm grateful beyond words. But I don't want to become famous for being homeless. I want to be known for the music, for what it can do for people. How do we make sure this stays about the art and not about the tragedy?" Alan nodded approvingly, his respect for Sarah deepening with every conversation they had. "That's exactly the right question to ask, and it's why I knew you were the right person for this opportunity. Jennifer, can we structure these interviews to focus on the music and its impact? Let Sarah's story emerge naturally, but make it clear that she's an artist first, not a victim or a curiosity." "Absolutely," Jennifer agreed, making notes on her tablet. "Sarah, you have complete control over how much of your personal story you want to share. The song stands on its own merit. You don't owe anyone your pain as entertainment. We can frame this as the emergence of a major new talent who happens to have a compelling backstory rather than a sob story that happens to involve music." Marcus pulled up social media feeds on his laptop. "Look at these comments, Sarah. People aren't just saying they feel sorry for you. They're talking about the power of your voice, the authenticity of your performance, the way the song made them feel." One person wrote, "This isn't charity music, this is the real deal. Sarah Martinez has a voice that can heal hearts." As the evening progressed, Sarah watched her team field calls from media outlets, booking agents, and other musicians who wanted to collaborate. The phone rang constantly, each call representing another opportunity, another chance to share her music with people who needed to hear it. But the call that meant the most came near the end of the evening. Marcus handed Sarah the phone with a smile, saying simply, "You'll want to take this one. Is this Sarah Martinez?" The voice was familiar, though Sarah couldn't immediately place it. "Yes, this is Sarah. Sarah, this is Dolly Parton. I just heard your song on the radio, and honey, I had to call and tell you how beautiful it is. Your voice reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. It's real, it's honest, and it comes straight from the heart." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. Dolly Parton, the woman who had blazed trails for female country artists for decades, was calling her personally. "Miss Parton, I can't believe you're calling. Your music has been such an inspiration to me." "Well, sugar, your music is going to be an inspiration to a lot of people. I wanted you to know that what you're doing matters. In a world full of manufactured music, you're offering something authentic, and that's exactly what people need. Don't let anyone change that about you." After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence while her team continued their work around her. The magnitude of what was happening was beginning to sink in, but so was the weight of responsibility that came with having a platform. That night, after everyone had left and Sarah was alone in her apartment, she sat with her grandfather's guitar and tried to process the day's events. She thought about the radio interviews, the overwhelming response from listeners, the phone call from Dolly Parton, and the sudden trajectory her life had taken. She began to play softly, her fingers finding the chords to When Tomorrow Seems Too Far. As she sang the words that had started this journey, she thought about all the people who had called radio stations to share their own stories of struggle and hope. Each listener who had connected with her music represented someone who had felt alone in their pain, someone who needed to know that others had walked similar paths and survived. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. For years, Sarah had felt voiceless, invisible, forgotten by a society that preferred not to see its most vulnerable members. Now, she had a voice that people were listening to, a platform that could be used to advocate for those who were still invisible. She picked up her phone and scrolled through the social media comments that Marcus had shown her earlier. Mixed in with the praise for her music were messages from people sharing their own experiences with homelessness, job loss, depression, and recovery. Each comment represented a human being who had found some comfort or inspiration in her song. One comment particularly caught her attention. "I'm a veteran who's been living in my car for 6 months. Hearing Sarah's song on the radio today reminded me that I'm not alone, that this situation doesn't define who I am. Thank you for giving voice to those of us who usually don't get heard." Another read, "My daughter played this song for me after I lost my job last month. We both cried, and then we talked about hope in a way we never had before. Music really can heal." As Sarah read message after message, she began to understand that her sudden fame wasn't just about her personal success. It was about giving voice to experiences that society often ignored or stigmatized. Her platform came with the opportunity, and perhaps the obligation, to speak for those who were still voiceless. She thought about the people who were still sleeping on Nashville's streets tonight, still struggling to find their next meal, still hoping for someone to see their humanity beneath their circumstances. Her success didn't solve their problems, but perhaps it could open doors for conversations that needed to happen, for policies that needed to change, for hearts that needed to open. Sarah pulled out a notebook and began writing, her pen moving quickly across the page as lyrics flowed from her heart to her hand. The song that emerged was different from anything she had written before. It was a call to action, a challenge to listeners to see beyond stereotypes and statistics, to recognize the individuals who made up America's homeless population. Look past the cardboard sign. See the person standing there. They've got dreams like you and me, burdens that we all can share. Tomorrow seems so far away when you're sleeping on the ground, but hope is just a voice away if someone makes the sound. As she wrote, Sarah realized that this was her calling now, not just to entertain, but to educate, to advocate, to use her voice to bridge the gap between those who had fallen through society's cracks and those who had the power to help rebuild the safety net. The scared homeless woman and the emerging recording artist were both part of who she was now, and together they had created something that could make a real difference in people's lives. As Sarah prepared for bed in her own apartment, in her own bed, with the security of knowing she had a place to sleep tomorrow night, she carried with her the faces and voices of those who were still searching for that basic security. Her success was just the beginning. Now came the harder work of using that success to create lasting change, one song, one story, one heart at a time. 6 months after that first encounter outside the Ryman Auditorium, Sarah Martinez stood backstage at the Grand Ole Opry, adjusting her custom-made dress and trying to calm her racing heart. The burgundy gown, a gift from a designer who had been moved by her story, felt surreal against her skin. Not long ago, finding clean clothes had been a daily struggle. Now she was preparing to make her debut at country music's most sacred venue. The journey to this moment had been a whirlwind of recording sessions, interviews, and performances that had taken her across the country. When Tomorrow Seems Too Far had climbed to number 3 on the country charts, but more importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about homelessness, second chances, and the power of music to heal communities. The song's success had led to a full album deal, and Sarah had spent the past months working with Alan and other respected songwriters to create Finding Home, a collection of songs that explored themes of loss, resilience, and hope. Each track drew from her own experiences while speaking to universal human struggles that transcended her specific circumstances. 5 minutes, Miss Martinez, called the stage manager, a kind woman named Betty, who had worked at the Opry for over 20 years and had seen countless performers make their debuts on this historic stage. "Remember, these are your people out there. They already love you. Now just share your heart with them." Sarah nodded, trying to believe it. The Opry House was sold out, something that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. In the audience sat people from all walks of life: Nashville music industry veterans, tourists who had traveled from across the country, and a special section of seats reserved for individuals Sarah had met during her years on the streets. She had insisted on inviting people from local shelters and support services, wanting to share this moment with those who understood firsthand the journey she had traveled. Many of them had never been inside the Ryman Auditorium, never had the opportunity to experience live music in such an intimate, historic setting. Alan appeared beside her, looking calm and confident in his classic black suit. Over the months, he had become not just a collaborator but a mentor and friend, someone who understood both the privilege and the responsibility that came with having a voice that people trusted. "You ready for this?" he asked, seeing the nervousness in her eyes despite her outward composure. "I think so," Sarah replied, then laughed at herself. "Actually, no, I'm terrified, but I'm also more excited than I've been in years. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. Some of my best performances have come when I was scared to death." Alan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, these people aren't coming to judge you tonight. They're coming because your music has touched their lives, because you've given them something they needed to hear. Trust in that connection, and everything else will fall into place." Through the curtain, Sarah could hear the audience settling in, the buzz of conversation that filled the historic venue before every show. She peeked out and saw faces illuminated by the soft Opry lights, expectant, hopeful, ready to be moved by whatever she was about to share with them. As the lights dimmed and Alan walked out to introduce her, Sarah could hear the genuine warmth in the audience's applause. The sound was different from the polite appreciation she had experienced at some venues. This was the sound of people who had already connected with her music and were eager to experience it live. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alan's voice carried easily through the historic venue, filled with the warmth and gravitas that had made him beloved by millions. "It's been my privilege, over the past months, to work with one of the most authentic artists I've ever encountered. Her story reminds us that talent doesn't come with a pedigree, that the most powerful voices often belong to those who've had to find strength in the darkest places. Please welcome Sarah Martinez." The applause was thunderous as Sarah walked onto the Opry stage, her grandfather's guitar in her hands. The historic circle of worn wood beneath her feet had supported generations of country music legends, and for a moment she felt the weight of that legacy. Names like Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, and Loretta Lynn had stood in this same spot, sharing their hearts with audiences who needed to hear their stories. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, she saw not intimidating strangers, but fellow travelers. People who had known struggle and triumph, loss and love. In the front rows, she could see the faces of people from the shelters, many of them crying already just from seeing her on this stage. "Good evening," she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "6 months ago, I was playing this same guitar on the streets of Nashville, hoping for enough change to buy dinner. Tonight, I'm standing on the Grand Ole Opry stage, about to share songs with all of you. I don't think I'll ever stop being amazed by how quickly life can change when people choose to see possibility instead of problems." She began with "When Tomorrow Seems Too Far," the song that had started it all, as her voice filled the auditorium, carrying the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had lived every word she was singing. The audience was completely silent, hanging on each note. By the second verse, Sarah could see people wiping away tears, their faces reflecting the emotions the song had unlocked. The second song was new, one she had written specifically for this performance after months of meeting with people who had been affected by her music. "Invisible No More" spoke directly to her experience of homelessness, but more broadly to anyone who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed by society. The lyrics were unflinchingly honest about the dehumanization that comes with poverty, but they were also defiant, asserting the dignity and worth of every person, regardless of their circumstances. "I see you looking through me like I'm made of glass. Like my troubles and my dreams ain't meant to last, but this heart keeps beating, these hands can still create, and maybe if you listened, you'd see it's not too late. I'm invisible no more, standing in the light of everything I'm fighting for." The response was overwhelming. The audience rose to their feet as one, the applause continuing for several minutes while Sarah stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the emotion she could see on hundreds of faces. But what struck her most profoundly were the faces she could see in the front rows. People from the shelters, people who had lived experiences similar to her own, many of them crying openly as they applauded not just her performance, but the recognition of their own dignity in her words. For her third song, Sarah performed Grandmother's Hands, a tribute to the woman who had raised her after her parents died, teaching her that music could heal wounds that words couldn't reach. The song painted a picture of weathered hands that had worked in fields and kitchens, hands that had played guitar and braided hair, hands that had held a frightened child and shown her that love could survive any loss. Grandmother's hands, they told stories without words, of struggles overcome and dreams deferred. They taught me that music lives in the heart, that even when everything falls apart, there's a song waiting to be found, in the silence, in the sound. And as she sang, Sarah thought about all the hands that had helped her along the way, the shelter workers who had treated her with dignity, the strangers who had dropped coins in her guitar case, Alan Jackson's hand extended in friendship and opportunity, and now the hands of audience members reaching out to applaud not just her music, but the journey that had brought her to this moment. After the formal performance ended, Sarah did something unprecedented in Opry history. Instead of leaving the stage, she asked Alan to join her for an impromptu question-and-answer session, wanting to use the platform to have a deeper conversation about the issues her music had brought to light. "Sarah," called out a voice from the audience, "what do you want people to know about homelessness that they might not understand?" "That it can happen to anyone," she replied without hesitation, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. "I had a college degree, a professional job, a good credit score, health insurance. But when you lose your income and don't have family who can help, you can go from housed to homeless faster than you can imagine. Most people living on the streets aren't there because of drugs or mental illness, though those problems exist too and deserve compassion. They're there because our society doesn't have enough safety nets to catch people when they fall." Another audience member asked, "What can ordinary people do to help?" "Vote for policies that support affordable housing and mental health services," Sarah said, her response reflecting months of studying the systemic issues that contribute to homelessness. "Volunteer at shelters or soup kitchens. Donate to organizations that provide services, not just meals, but job training, healthcare, addiction treatment. But also, and this might be most important, see homeless people as people. Make eye contact, say hello, recognize that the person asking for help is someone's daughter or son, someone with dreams and talents and a story worth knowing." A young woman in the audience stood up. "Sarah, I work at a homeless shelter here in Nashville, and I want you to know that your music has given hope to so many of our residents. But what would you say to people who are currently experiencing homelessness and feel like there's no way out?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the nights when she had felt exactly that way, when tomorrow had seemed not just far away but impossible to reach. "I would tell them that they are not invisible, even when society makes them feel that way," she said finally. "I would tell them that their current circumstances do not define their worth or their potential. I would tell them to hold on to whatever brings them hope, music, art, faith, the memory of better times, the dream of what could be. And I would tell them that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength, a recognition that none of us can survive alone." Alan nodded approvingly. "Sarah, I've watched you use this platform not just to advance your own career, but to advocate for others. That's not something I see very often in this business." "Music has always been about storytelling," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the conviction that had impressed everyone who had worked with her. "And the best stories, the ones that really matter, are the ones that help us understand each other better. I happen to live through something that gave me a story worth sharing, but there are thousands of other people with equally important stories who just haven't had the microphone yet." She gestured toward the section where people from the shelters were sitting. "Some of the most talented, intelligent, creative people I've ever met are sitting in that section right now. They're poets and musicians and artists and teachers and veterans and parents who are going through the hardest time of their lives. My job isn't just to entertain people. It's to remind everyone that we're all more alike than we are different, that we all deserve dignity and respect and the chance to contribute our gifts to the world." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with audience members sharing their own experiences and asking thoughtful questions about how music could be used to create social change. It was unlike anything that had ever happened on the Opry stage, transforming what was typically an entertainment venue into a space for meaningful dialogue about important issues. After the show, the backstage area was crowded with well-wishers, music industry professionals, and media representatives. But Sarah sought out the group from the shelters first, spending nearly an hour talking with people who had made the journey to see her perform. Maria, a woman Sarah had met at a downtown shelter 2 years earlier, was crying as she embraced her old acquaintance. Maria had been struggling with addiction and had lost custody of her children, but she had been clean for 4 months and was working toward reunification. "Sarah, watching you up there tonight, you gave me hope that things can change," Maria said through her tears. "I've been clean for 4 months now, and I start a job training program next week. Seeing what you've accomplished makes me believe I can do it too. You showed us that our past doesn't have to determine our future." These conversations meant more to Sarah than any industry accolades. Each person who saw their own potential reflected in her success represented the real purpose behind her platform. As she finally made her way through the crowd of media and industry figures, she carried with her the faces and stories of people who understood that her triumph was, in some small way, a victory for anyone who had ever been counted out. A young man named David, who had been living in his car for 3 months after losing his job in manufacturing, handed Sarah a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this poem after hearing your first song," he said shyly. "I never thought I was creative, but your music made me want to try expressing myself." Sarah read the poem, which spoke of hope surviving in the darkest places, of dreams that refused to die even in the most difficult circumstances. The words were raw and honest, showing real talent for imagery and emotion. "David, this is beautiful," she said sincerely. "Have you thought about coming to some of the open mic nights around town? There are venues that would love to hear your voice." The interaction reminded Sarah that her role was not just to be successful herself, but to inspire others to find and use their own voices, to create opportunities for talents that might otherwise remain hidden. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room with Eleanor, who had flown in from Phoenix to witness her sister's Opry debut. They watched news coverage of the performance on the late-night shows, marveling at how the story was being covered not just as entertainment news, but as a broader social issue. "The Today Show wants you next week," Elena said, scrolling through messages on Sarah's phone. "And there's a documentary crew that wants to follow you for the next album. Sarah, you're becoming the voice for a lot of people who don't usually get heard. How does that feel?" Sarah nodded, feeling both the privilege and the weight of that responsibility. "It's overwhelming sometimes. I keep thinking about all the people who are still out there, still struggling, still hoping for their chance. How do I make sure this momentum helps them too, not just me?" "By continuing to be exactly who you are," Elena replied, echoing what Alan had told Sarah months earlier. "By remembering where you came from and using your voice to lift up the people who are still where you used to be. And by never forgetting that your talent was always there. Circumstances just kept it hidden for a while." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she looked out her hotel window at the Nashville skyline, the same view she had seen from very different circumstances not long ago. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new platforms, new chances to use her voice for something bigger than herself. Her grandfather's guitar sat in the corner of the room, its worn case now bearing stickers from venues around the country where she had been invited to perform. But it was still the same instrument that had carried her through the darkest periods of her life, and she knew it would continue to be her companion as she navigated this new chapter. The scared, hungry woman who had played for coins outside the Ryman was still part of her story, but she was no longer the whole story. Now Sarah Martinez was an artist with a platform, a voice with power, and a responsibility to use both in service of something greater than personal success. As she drifted off to sleep, she could still hear the echoes of the Opry audience singing along with her final song of the evening, hundreds of voices joining hers in a chorus that proclaimed that everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, Sarah Martinez rested in the knowledge that she had used her gifts to remind people of their shared humanity, and that was worth everything she had endured to get here. 1 year after her Grand Ole Opry debut, Sarah Martinez stood in the construction zone that would soon become the Sarah Martinez Center for Music and Hope, a facility dedicated to providing music education and support services for individuals experiencing homelessness. The building, located in downtown Nashville, just blocks from where she used to perform for tips, was being funded by proceeds from her album sales and donations from supporters who had been moved by her story. The transformation of the abandoned warehouse into a state-of-the-art facility had become a symbol of the broader changes Sarah's story had inspired across the country. Cities from Los Angeles to New York had reached out for advice on creating similar programs, and Sarah had found herself consulting with mayors, social workers, and fellow musicians on how to use art as a tool for social change. "The recording studios should be finished next month," said David Chen, the project manager, as he walked Sarah through the space. His hard hat was covered with stickers from various Nashville music venues, a testament to his own love for the city's musical heritage. "And the apartment units upstairs will be ready for residents by spring. We've already had over 200 applications from people who want to be part of the program." Sarah nodded, trying to envision the finished space filled with music and hope. The center would offer free music lessons, recording opportunities, and transitional housing for homeless individuals who wanted to develop their artistic talents while working towards stability. It was an ambitious project, one that had grown from conversations with Alan Jackson about how to create lasting change rather than just temporary relief. "Sarah," David continued, his voice filled with the enthusiasm that had made him the perfect choice to oversee this project, "I have to tell you, in 20 years of construction management, I've never worked on a project that has generated this level of community support. We've had volunteers showing up every weekend, local businesses donating materials, and musicians offering to teach classes for free. This building represents something bigger than just another social service. It represents hope made tangible." The volunteer response had been overwhelming from the beginning. Nashville's music community had rallied around the project, with everyone from session musicians to major recording artists contributing their time and resources. Construction workers had donated overtime hours, architects had waived fees, and equipment manufacturers had provided instruments and recording gear at cost. As they toured the space, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Turn on CNN at 8 p.m. tonight. The documentary is about to air, and early reviews are incredible." For the past 6 months, Sarah had been working with filmmaker Rebecca Santos on Finding Home, A Voice from the Streets, a documentary that followed her journey while also exploring the broader issue of homelessness in America. The film had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to standing ovations and critical acclaim, with many reviewers calling it a powerful examination of how individual stories could illuminate systemic problems. Tonight marked its premiere on national television, potentially reaching millions of viewers who hadn't yet heard Sarah's story. Rebecca had approached the project with sensitivity and intelligence, understanding that Sarah's story was just one thread in a much larger tapestry of American poverty and resilience. The filmmaker had spent months interviewing other homeless individuals, social workers, policy experts, and musicians, creating a comprehensive look at both the problem and potential solutions. That evening, Sarah gathered with her team at Alan Jackson's home outside Nashville to watch the documentary together. The group included not just industry professionals, but also many of the people who had been part of her story: shelter workers, former homeless individuals who had become advocates, and the street musicians who still performed downtown and were now being supported through Sarah's foundation. The living room was filled with an eclectic mix of people who might never have met under other circumstances. Dr. Patricia Williams, a social worker who had been instrumental in developing the center's programming, sat next to Tommy Rodriguez, a formerly homeless veteran who now worked as a peer counselor. Maria, who had overcome her addiction and regained custody of her children, was there with David, the young man who had shared his poetry with Sarah after her Opry performance. As the documentary began, Sarah watched her own transformation unfold on screen. Rebecca had obtained footage of her street performances from tourists who had recorded them, creating a visual timeline of her journey from invisibility to international recognition. But more importantly, the film captured the stories of dozens of other homeless individuals, giving voice to experiences that too often remained hidden. The documentary opened with statistics about homelessness in America, but quickly moved beyond numbers to focus on individual faces and stories. The camera captured daily life in shelters, the challenges of finding employment without a permanent address, and the complex web of factors that could lead to homelessness. "This is beautiful," whispered Elena, who was sitting beside her sister on the couch. She had flown in from Phoenix specifically for the premiere, bringing with her their elderly Aunt Rosa, who had helped raise both sisters after their parents' death. Rebecca did an amazing job showing that your story is one of many, not the exception. The documentary's most powerful moment came when Sarah returned to the streets where she had lived, accompanied by current homeless individuals who shared their own dreams and struggles. The camera captured her sitting on the same corner where Alan Jackson had first heard her sing, now surrounded by people who saw in her success the possibility of their own transformation. "Music saved my life," one young man told the camera, his voice carrying the same raw honesty that had first attracted Alan to Sarah's performances. "But it was Sarah's story that made me believe I could save my own life too. She showed us that talent doesn't have an address, that art can come from anywhere, and that society's definition of worthy is often wrong." Another segment featured Sarah visiting schools in low-income neighborhoods, talking with students about pursuing their dreams despite difficult circumstances. The camera captured her working with a teenage girl who had been living in foster care, helping her write songs about her experiences and encouraging her to see her story as a source of strength rather than shame. "Music gives you a way to turn pain into something beautiful," Sarah told the girl in the documentary. "It doesn't make the pain go away, but it transforms it into something that can help other people feel less alone." As the film concluded with footage of Sarah's Opry performance and the announcement of the center's construction, the room erupted in applause, but Sarah was focused on her phone, which was lighting up with messages from around the country as viewers responded to what they had just watched. "Sarah," Alan said, looking at his own phone with amazement, "the hashtag #ShoeVoices from the streets is already trending on Twitter. People are sharing stories of homeless individuals in their own communities who have artistic talents. This is exactly the kind of awareness we hoped the documentary would create." The social media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the documentary's airing, stories were pouring in from across the country about talented individuals who were experiencing homelessness. Musicians, poets, artists, and writers who had been invisible to most of society were suddenly being recognized and supported by their communities. In Los Angeles, a video of a homeless saxophone player went viral, leading to offers of recording sessions and performance opportunities. In Chicago, a woman who had been writing poetry while living in her car was invited to participate in a local arts festival. In Atlanta, a group of musicians who performed in subway stations were offered space to practice and develop their skills. Over the following weeks, the impact of the documentary exceeded everyone's expectations. Music venues across the country began hosting Voice from the Streets nights, providing platforms for homeless performers. Cities started implementing programs modeled after Sarah's center. Most significantly, the national conversation about homelessness began to shift from viewing it as a personal failure to understanding it as a systemic issue that required comprehensive solutions. The documentary's influence reached into unexpected corners of society. Corporate executives began volunteering at shelters, students organized benefit concerts at universities, and religious congregations started hosting musicians who were experiencing homelessness. The film had accomplished what Sarah had always hoped her music would do. It had humanized an issue that many people preferred to ignore. 3 months after the documentary aired, Sarah found herself invited to testify before Congress about arts funding and affordable housing policy. Standing in the Capitol building, dressed in a simple blue suit that somehow made her feel both professional and authentic, she spoke to lawmakers about the human cost of inadequate social services. The hearing room was packed with media, advocates, and citizens who had traveled to Washington to support her testimony. Sarah had spent weeks preparing with policy experts, learning about the complex legislation that could address homelessness at a national level. "Senators, representatives," she began, her voice carrying the same clarity that had moved audiences in concert halls across the country. "I stand before you not as a country music star, but as someone who lived on your streets for 3 years. I had a master's degree in music education, but that meant nothing when I couldn't afford rent. I had tremendous artistic ability, but that was invisible when I was homeless." She paused, making eye contact with legislators from both parties who had requested this hearing. Some of them shifted uncomfortably as she spoke, perhaps confronting for the first time the reality that homelessness could affect educated, talented individuals. The question isn't whether homeless individuals deserve help, it's whether we as a society deserve to waste so much human potential. Every person sleeping rough tonight has skills, dreams, and talents that could contribute to our communities if they had the basic stability of housing and healthcare. My story isn't remarkable because I had special gifts. It's remarkable because I had the incredible fortune to be heard by someone who chose to see possibility instead of problems. Sarah's testimony was interrupted several times by applause from the gallery, an unusual occurrence in the typically formal setting of congressional hearings. She spoke for 20 minutes, sharing specific policy recommendations that had been developed by experts in the field. I'm asking you to fund programs that don't just provide temporary shelter, but that invest in human potential. Arts programs, job training, mental health services, affordable housing, these aren't charity expenses, they're investments in the fabric of our communities. When we help someone move from homelessness to stability, we're not just changing one life, we're strengthening all of our communities. The legislation that emerged from those hearings, dubbed the Voice Act by the media, allocated federal funding for arts-based programs in homeless services and created grant opportunities for community centers like the one Sarah was building. It passed with bipartisan support, a rare achievement in an era of political division. The success of the legislation was attributed in part to Sarah's ability to speak about complex policy issues in human terms that resonated with lawmakers regardless of their political affiliation. Her testimony had been viewed millions of times online, making it one of the most watched congressional hearings of the year. Back in Nashville, the Sarah Martinez Center for Music and Hope opened its doors on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after Sarah had first met Alan Jackson. The opening ceremony drew hundreds of people, including many of country music's biggest stars who had volunteered to perform at the inaugural concert. The center was more than just a building. It was a comprehensive program designed to address the multiple barriers that prevented homeless individuals from achieving stability. In addition to music education and recording facilities, the center offered job training, mental health services, addiction counseling, and transitional housing. This represents everything we've learned about what really works, explained Dr. Williams as she led tours of the facility. It's not enough to just provide services. You have to provide them in a way that respects people's dignity and recognizes their strengths. The center's programming was based on the understanding that homelessness was rarely caused by a single factor and therefore couldn't be solved by a single intervention. The music component served as both a therapeutic tool and a potential pathway to employment, while the housing program provided the stability that made everything else possible. But the most moving moment of the opening ceremony came when Maria, the woman Sarah had met in the shelter years earlier, took the stage. Now clean and sober, working as a peer counselor at a recovery center and reunited with her children, Maria had been writing songs about her own journey. As she sang her original composition, Second Chances, her voice carried the same authentic emotion that had first attracted Alan Jackson to Sarah's performances. "This is what it's all about," Alan said to Sarah as they watched from the wings. "Not just your success, but the platform you've created for others to find their voices too." Maria's song spoke of redemption and resilience, of the possibility of rebuilding life from the ground up, with the support of people who believed in second chances. The audience was completely silent as she sang, many of them crying as they recognized their own struggles in her words. "I was broken, thought my story was through, till someone saw past what I'd been through. Now I'm standing here with something to say, that yesterday's pain can light today's way." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the audience. In the front rows sat teenagers from local high schools, many of them from low-income families who had never seen live music performed in an intimate setting. Behind them were formerly homeless individuals who now had apartments in the center's transitional housing program. Scattered throughout were music industry professionals, city officials, and ordinary citizens who had been moved to support the center's mission. The diversity of the audience reflected the broader impact of Sarah's story. Her music had crossed traditional boundaries of race, class, and age, speaking to something universal in the human experience. The center itself had become a symbol of what was possible when communities came together around shared values of dignity and opportunity. As the evening progressed, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scared, hungry woman who had played guitar for coins seemed like a character from someone else's story, yet she remained an essential part of who Sarah had become. That experience of vulnerability and marginalization now informed every decision she made about how to use her platform. During the intermission, Sarah was approached by Jennifer, the young woman who had been living in her car when Sarah first met her after the Opry performance. Jennifer was now living in the center's transitional housing and working part-time while developing her songwriting skills. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that I got accepted to Belmont University's music program," Jennifer said, her face glowing with excitement. "The scholarship committee said my audition song moved them to tears. I would never have had the confidence to apply if I hadn't met you." Stories like Jennifer's were becoming increasingly common. The center's residents and program participants were achieving successes that extended far beyond basic stability. They were enrolling in college, starting their own businesses, reconnecting with family members, and contributing their talents to the broader community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said as she took the stage for the final performance of the evening, "2 years ago, I was invisible on these same streets. Tonight, we're opening a space where no one's voice will ever be invisible again. Music has always been the language that helps us understand each other's hearts, and this center will make sure that language is accessible to everyone, regardless of their circumstances." She began to sing "When Tomorrow Seems Too Far," the song that had started it all, but now the words carried new meaning. Tomorrow no longer seemed distant for the people gathered in this space. It seemed full of possibility, full of second chances, full of the promise that talent and dreams could triumph over circumstances. As she sang, Sarah looked out at faces that represented every part of her journey. There was Alan Jackson, whose willingness to take a chance on a street performer had started this entire movement. There was Elena, whose unwavering support had helped Sarah rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of separation. There was Dr. Williams, whose expertise had transformed Sarah's vision into a sustainable program that could actually change lives. But most importantly, there were the faces of people who were still in the early stages of their own journeys, from homelessness to hope. Some were current residents of the center, others were participants in the day programs, and still others were people from the community who had come to see what was possible when society invested in human potential rather than simply managing human problems. As the last notes faded, the audience rose to their feet, but Sarah's eyes were drawn to a young woman in the back corner who was wiping away tears. After the show, she made her way through the crowd to introduce herself. "Hi," the young woman said shyly. "I'm Christina. I've been living in my car for the past month and I write songs. I heard about this place and thought maybe I could audition for the program?" Sarah smiled, seeing in Christina's hopeful eyes the same mixture of fear and determination she had once carried herself. The cycle was continuing, her success creating opportunities for others to find their own voices, their own paths to stability and fulfillment. "Christina," she said, "do you have your songs with you?" "Yes, ma'am. I mean, they're not professional or anything, but they're from my heart. That's the most important thing. Would you like to sing one for me right now?" As Christina's voice filled the empty performance space, Sarah heard echoes of her own journey, but also something entirely unique. Another authentic voice with its own story to tell, its own path to follow. This was why the center existed, why all the work and advocacy and difficult conversations with politicians mattered. Christina sang about holding on to dreams, even when everything else had fallen apart. About finding strength in music when the world seemed determined to silence her voice. Her lyrics were raw and honest, reflecting the reality of life on the margins while maintaining hope for something better. Every voice deserved to be heard. Every dream deserved a chance to grow. And every person, regardless of their current circumstances, deserved to believe that tomorrow was within reach. As Sarah listened to Christina sing about hope surviving in the darkest places, she realized that her own story was no longer just about one woman's journey from the streets to stardom. It had become something larger, a reminder that in every community, on every street corner, there were voices waiting to be discovered, stories waiting to be told, and dreams waiting for someone to believe they were worth pursuing. The scared homeless woman and the successful recording artist were both part of who she was now, and together they had created something that would outlast any individual song or performance. A legacy of hope that would continue to echo through the voices of everyone who found their way to this center, everyone who discovered that their story mattered, and everyone who learned that being invisible was never permanent. Sometimes you just needed someone to really listen. Outside the center, Nashville's lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the city other voices were waiting to be heard. Sarah Martinez had found her way home, and now she was dedicated to helping others find theirs too. One song, one story, one second chance at a time. 3 years later, as Sarah stood on stage at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., receiving a national award for her advocacy work, she carried with her the voices of hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her music and her mission. The scared woman who had once sung for coins was now a recognized leader in social change, but she had never forgotten the lessons learned during those dark nights on Nashville's streets. In her acceptance speech, Sarah spoke about the power of music to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. She talked about the importance of seeing potential in unexpected places and the responsibility that came with having a platform. Music taught me that our differences are just different notes in the same song, she told the audience of dignitaries and advocates. When we learn to hear each other's voices, when we create space for every person's story to be told, we create harmony out of what once seemed like chaos. The Kennedy Center Award was just the latest recognition of work that had grown far beyond anything Sarah had imagined when she first picked up her grandfather's guitar on the streets of Nashville. Centers modeled after hers now operated in over 50 cities, creating a network of hope that had helped thousands of people transition from homelessness to stability. But the real measure of success wasn't in awards or statistics. It was in voices like Christina's, who had graduated from the center's program and was now recording her first album. It was in Maria's children, who had written songs about how proud they were of their mother's recovery. It was in David's poetry, which had been published in a national magazine and had touched readers across the country. The legacy of a voice that had once been silenced by circumstance now lived on in a chorus of hope that continued to grow, proving that sometimes the most powerful music comes not from those who have never fallen, but from those who have learned to sing while they rise. As Sarah walked off the Kennedy Center stage, she thought about her grandfather's words. Music is the language that speaks when words are not enough. He had been right. Music had become the bridge between her pain and her purpose, between her past and her future, between her individual story and the universal human experience of struggling toward hope. The scared, homeless woman would always be part of her story, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how important it was to extend compassion to those who were still struggling. But she was no longer the whole story. Now, Sarah Martinez was a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between worlds and living proof that with enough support and opportunity, anyone could transform their deepest pain into their greatest purpose. Outside the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C.'s lights reflected off the Potomac River, and somewhere in the city, other voices were waiting to be heard. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid for a movement that would continue long after any individual song faded from the radio. Every voice mattered, every story had value, and every person deserved the chance to discover that their dreams were not just possible, but necessary for the healing of a world that desperately needed to learn how to listen